President of Bolivia's Senate held a meeting with international observers to the country's general elections, set to take place this Sunday. The World Health Organization has data showing that the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths continues to increase worldwide. The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has reported an increase in COVID-19 cases and deaths, warning of a possible second wave across the continent. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Katrina Goss. On Friday, the President of Bolivia's Senate, Eva Copa, held a meeting with international observers to the country's general elections, set to take place this Sunday. The Commission of International Observers to Bolivia's general elections arrived in the country on Friday and is made up of representatives from the United Nations, the European Union and regional parliaments, among others. The meeting with the Senate President was aimed at addressing final details for Election Day. Meanwhile, the observers were optimistic about the vote, noting that the general elections represent a step towards the peace-building process in the country. The international representatives also noted that they will hold meetings with some presidential candidates and social organizations ahead of the vote. Meanwhile, the President of the Chamber of Deputies of Bolivia's plurinational legislative assembly, Sergio Choque, has called on the population to cast their vote in the general elections, while also urging political actors to refrain from promoting violence.
We are broke economically, but that will not prevent us from facing this challenge that our homeland has presented to us. We must all participate and vote for a pair of running mates that we support, whoever they may be, so that they can take our country out of this economic crisis in which we have been plunged due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also as a result of public mismanagement that had been carried out. We Bolivians are working so that the country's economy can grow again. In this regard, I ask those people or certain figures to stop trying to intimidate the population, to stop seeking to disrupt the country. I ask them to call for the unity of Bolivians. We have to respect the decisions shown at the ballot boxes.
And the President of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal of Bolivia has invited voters to participate in the October 18th general elections and guaranteed that the population will have access to all of the voting records.
The Supreme Electoral Court has worked throughout with technical seriousness, political impartiality and transparency, so that we have a proper electoral process, where the basic principle is that the will of the people, expressed in the polls, be reflected in the results of the elections. We invite all citizens to go and vote in an atmosphere of tranquility and serenity, with security and confident that the electoral process is legitimate, transparent and reliable. We must regain confidence in the electoral authority and the electoral process, because we have worked properly.
The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has called for a calm and inclusive environment that ensures respect for human rights ahead of Bolivia's general elections to be held on October 18th.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has urged Bolivia's authorities, political and other actors to refrain from any actions that could undermine the peaceful conduct of the general elections that are taking place this Sunday. In light of the political and human rights crises that were unleashed during the previous attempt to carry out these elections a year ago, Bachelet has expressed her hope that Sunday's elections would take place in a calm, participatory and inclusive manner, in an environment that ensures respect for human rights of all people in Bolivia. It is essential, the High Commissioner says, that all sides avoid further acts of violence that could spark a confrontation. No one wants to see a repeat of last year's events, which led to extensive human rights violations and abuses, including at least 30 people killed and more than 800 injured, and ultimately to everyone losing out.
The Colombian Indigenous and Rural Mobilization, known as AMINGA, arrived in the western city of Ibagué in the department of Tolima, where it will continue to voice its social demands. Nearly 3,000 indigenous people from the southwestern department of Cauca and other regions of the country will spend the night in the city before continuing their journey towards the capital, Bogotá, on Saturday, where about 10,000 participants of the social mobilization are expected to gather. The members of the mobilization are received by students of the University of Tolima and members of the Regional Indigenous Council of Tolima and will carry out social activities during their stay. Domingo gathered in a city centre where the social coordinators of Tolima department called on the population to join the indigenous mobilization while observing biosecurity protocols. On Friday, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador stressed that the arrest of former Defense Secretary General Salvador Cienfuegos on drug trafficking and money laundering charges at Los Angeles International Airport on Thursday was evidence of the widespread corruption under past administrations. General Cienfuegos was the country's top military official during the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto.
This is an unmistakable example of the decomposition of the government, of how civil service was degrading the government service during the neoliberal period. All those who are currently in the government, in the Defense Secretary, and are involved in this matter of General Cienfuegos will be suspended, withdrawn, and if it's the case, taken to the relevant authorities.
The sugar industry was once a pillar of the Dominican Republic's economy, but the story is very different today. Our correspondent Daisy Toussaint looks back at the history of the sector.
The sugar industry was for a long time one of the great pillars of the Dominican economy.
During the U.S. occupation of the island from 1915 to 1934 in Haiti and from 1916 to 1924 in the Dominican Republic, that an insular migratory scheme is institutionalized from the rural zone in Haiti to the Dominican sugar cane plantations that were at that time of mostly American capital.
But the industry has been in crisis since the late 80s, leading to the end of state contracts between Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1986 and causing the closure of many sugar mills.
But this reached its climax in 1997, 1998, when former President Leonel Fernandez unleashed a wave of neoliberal policies which led to the privatization and then closure of most of the state sugar council's mills. This not only made the already precarious living conditions of the sugarcane workers even worse, but it was enough for thousands of Haitian families and their Dominican children to survive. These neoliberal policies also provided the means to socially dispose this population, confiscating their acquired rights such as pensions and access to health insurance.
Now there are only the remains of what one day was the place where the spinal cord of the country's economy developed. Today the abandonment is reflected in the eyes of thousands of immigrant workers who left their homelands looking for survival.
I came here on January 7, 1970. Then I was in Jimani and I came here to start shopping sugarcane. I have been using a probe for 8 years and I have no help. There is no work and we are having a hard time, and I am having a hard time here.
The faces of these workers are the reflection of the abandonment that the Dominican authorities paid for the work.
The Haitian worker was intrinsically associated with and forced into the most exhausting and devalued and malplayable work as that of the sugar industry, but also forced to exist in strict and monitored conditions of confinement in the batalles, whose housing and sanitary situations continue to be deplorable today.
It is estimated that in the Dominican Republic there are 411 batalles, the Creole name for rural distant settlements, and over 50,000 workers, most of them Haitians and their descendants, but there are only 4 sugar mills left, 2 private and 2 state-run. This is one of the few sugar mills operating in the country, unlike in the 80s when thousands of workers were needed for the operation of the sugar factories. The noises of the old machine stopped. The rust took over one day was the engine of the economy, and all that remains is the rubble and the memories reflected in the abandonment. Para TeleSUR, Daisy Toussaint, República Dominicana.
According to the latest data from the World Health Organization, the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths continues to increase worldwide. The number of COVID-19 cases worldwide has now surpassed 39.2 million, while the death toll has exceeded 1.1 million. According to a WHO situation report by region, the Americas remains the hardest hit, accounting for nearly half of the global tally. Next are Southeast Asia and Europe, with more than 8 million and 7 million confirmed cases, respectively. The United States is the hardest hit nation in the world, with more than 8.2 million confirmed cases and over 223,000 deaths. India and Brazil rank second and third in the world in terms of the number of cases, reporting over 7.4 million and 5.1 million, respectively. This Friday, Belgian authorities warned that stronger measures are required in order to halt the spread of COVID-19.
Today, the new government will introduce this barometer on the COVID-19 outbreak that we were waiting for, and will also present new measures, which will be more severe than the current ones. On the medical level, it is obvious for everyone that new measures are necessary, because all the figures, all the data is rising and all the indicators are and remain in red. In the perspective of what will happen in the coming days, maybe early next week, in the perspective of more severe measures, we are asking all of you before the weekend break to not repeat the kind of situations that occurred when the confinement started back in March. Do not do unleashed parties and try, as someone who is about to be punished, to enjoy things for one last time. This kind of behavior led in the next 10 to 15 following days to an increase of infections, and quite a lot of these people found themselves in hospitals. So please avoid this kind of stupid behavior this weekend. During the last 7 days, we had an average of almost 6,000 new cases per day, 5,976 new cases precisely, which is almost a 100% increase, 96% to be precise. On Monday this week, we broke another sad record with 8,582 new cases. Unfortunately, we are breaking these records day after day, as even if the Tuesday figures are not yet definite, we expect to reach 10,000 positive cases.
On Friday, Germany confirmed more than 7,000 new coronavirus cases for the first time, representing its second consecutive daily record. Germany is still in relatively good shape compared with several neighbouring countries, which are also seeing record figures. Earlier this week, the federal and state governments agreed to toughen mask-wearing rules. The European nation has confirmed more than 355,000 cases since the outbreak of the pandemic and over 9,800 deaths. The Czech Republic's health minister said on Friday that the country should brace for a huge influx of COVID-19 infections over at least the next 10 days to 2 weeks. Coronavirus infections in the country have reached a new daily record of confirmed cases for the second consecutive day. The health ministry reported over 9,700 new cases in the last 24 hours. To date, the nation of over 10 million has confirmed over 149,000 cases, with 50,000 of them registered last week. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 death toll stands at more than 1,200. Hospitals across the country have postponed unnecessary planned operations to focus on the growing number of COVID-19 patients. On Friday, Finland's Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, left the European Union Summit of Heads of State and Government in Belgium as a precautionary measure after learning that a Finnish lawmaker she recently attended a meeting with had tested positive for COVID-19. The move came one day after European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen left the summit venue in Brussels shortly after talks began because one of her close staffers tested positive for the virus. Two other EU top officials, Joseph Borrell and Janis Lenarek, also went into isolation this week after coming into contact with people who tested positive for the virus during a trip to Ethiopia. French President Emmanuel Macron has reiterated the European Union's willingness to reach a final post-Brexit trade agreement, while highlighting that negotiations required effort, particularly from British authorities. The statements come following the conclusion on Friday of a two-day European Union Leaders' Summit. The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that COVID-19 infections and deaths have increased in recent weeks, warning of the possibility of a second wave of the epidemic across the continent. So far, health institutions across Africa have confirmed more than 1 million COVID-19 cases and over 39,000 deaths. Fortunately, over 1.3 million patients have recovered from the virus. The countries with the highest number of COVID-19 related deaths are South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria and Ethiopia, which also rank among the top 6 nations in Africa in terms of the number of confirmed cases. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned on Friday that the COVID-19 pandemic has further intensified food insecurity to a level not seen in decades. In a video message to mark World Food Day, the UN chief stressed that in a world of plenty, it is a grave affront that hundreds of millions go to bed hungry each night. About 130 million people are at risk of being pushed to the brink of starvation by the end of this year, and this on top of the 690 million people who already lack enough food, according to the UN. Guterres announced that he will convene a food systems summit next year to inspire action towards resolving this issue. He stressed that we need food systems that provide decent, safe livelihoods for workers to create a more resilient, equitable and sustainable world.
Poorly manufactured tests.
United Nations officials have warned of an unprecedented crisis in the Sahel region of Africa as escalating violence, rising levels of food insecurity, continued displacement and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are triggering the conditions for one of the world's worst humanitarian emergencies.
The humanitarian situation has deteriorated sharply over the past 2 years. Needs are rising faster than funding can keep up. People living in the border region between Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger are now at an epicenter of conflict, poverty and climate change.
The Central Sahel countries of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger are the epicenter of the forced displacement crisis. More than 1.5 internally displaced people, IDPs, and 365,000 refugees have fled violence in the Central Sahel, including over 600,000 this year alone.
A record 7.2 million children in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger now require humanitarian assistance. This is up 2/3 in just 1 year. Over 1 million children have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Safe water, so critical for the survival of young children and for preventing COVID-19, is scarcer than ever, particularly so among those displaced.
More than 350 prisoners were freed on Friday on the second day of a landmark exchange between the warring sides in Yemen. The prisoner swap is a rare sign of progress in efforts to end the conflict in Yemen. Aircrafts arranged by the International Committee of the Red Cross shuttled between Sana'a and Yemen's second city, Aden, transporting released prisoners. The ICRC, tasked with the logistics of the complex 2-day operation, announced that on Thursday it flew more than 700 freed detainees to cities in both Yemen and neighbouring Saudi Arabia. The warring sides agreed to release over 1,000 prisoners in talks held in Switzerland last month.
As you can see today, 76 former prisoners were transferred from Sana'a to Aden and another 101 former prisoners from Aden to Sana'a. If everything goes as planned, we hope for more aircraft, which will bring more prisoners to and from different cities in Yemen.
Several areas in central Vietnam are still submerged in floodwaters, with local residents relying on relief aid for food and clean water. 2 storms in a week have brought devastating rains to parts of central and northern Vietnam. Close to 1 million people have been impacted by the severe weather. Authorities said Thursday that 9 members of a rescue team were found dead after trying to save workers from a hydropower plant engulfed by a landslide in central Vietnam. Officials have stated that at least 40 people died in last week's flooding and landslides across the country. Neighbouring Cambodia has also been badly hit by floods. According to the Cambodian National Committee for Disaster Management, 13 people have been killed, including 5 children. In Thailand, pro-democracy activists defied an emergency decree banning gatherings for a second night in a row. Police forces used water cannons against protesters and clashes are reported in central Bangkok. Law enforcement erected razor wire and roadblocks to stop protesters returning to the area they occupied on Thursday night, but organisers switched plans, calling on demonstrators to gather at a different road junction. Despite the heavy rain, they took over the area to call for the resignation of the Prime Minister, the holding of new elections, a new constitution and reform of the monarchy. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For teleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss and thank you for watching.